Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we have with us from Berkeley, California, Ayelet Waldman, who is the author of A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. The novels she's written include Love and Treasure, Red Hook Road, Love and Other Impossible Pursuits, and Daughter's Keeper, as well as the essay collection Bad Mother, a chronicle of maternal crimes, minor calamities, and occasional moments of grace. She has also written the Mommy Track Mystery Series. She is the editor of Inside This Place, Not of It, Narratives from Women's Prisons, and of the forthcoming Kingdom of Olives and Ash, Writers Confront the Occupation. She has been a federal public defender and an adjunct professor at the UC Berkeley Law School, where she developed and taught a course on the legal implications of the war on drugs. She lives with her husband, Michael Shaban, and their 4 children. Welcome to the program.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to hear about your successes, your writing life, and especially your new book. So I need to start by telling you that besides reading your book and your website and information on Wikipedia, and now talking with you, I have found that you have a very full life. 4 children, 7 books, a blog, and other writing life activity. And the first
13
question...
books.
13 books.
13
okay,
books.
So
yeah.
Something I read. Maybe Wikipedia needs updating.
It sure does.
As a writer, I need to ask you, how is this possible? How did you accomplish all this?
I think that if you found any professional woman with children in any profession, you could ask her the same question. You could sort of go through a litany of accomplishments and say, how did you accomplish all this? I mean, that's what you got to do when you are engaged in this struggle, when you're trying to manage a career and manage family. You start to look and feel superhuman. Unfortunately, no one really usually gives you credit for it, right? I mean, my husband gets tremendous credit for managing to do the work of parenting while doing the work of writing. But usually with women, we just assume that they're just going to do it without complaining, or with complaining, but complaining only to their girlfriends.
Right, and I think you cover a little bit of that in your book when you're talking about how you always felt that you weren't doing enough to contribute to the household income, and to the point where it didn't even feel like you deserved your own office.
There was a long period where I felt like because I wasn't earning as much money as my husband, the most I could expect or demand is a seat at a cafe table. And I even went so far as when business of his business became so overwhelming that I could no longer do it myself, when we hired an assistant to manage that stuff for him, I even went so far as to give the assistant the little office that we had in our house that would have been a perfect writing studio. I just figured, well, she's got the real work to do. She's managing all of his travel and all of his booking and all of his paperwork, so she should have an office. And I can sit at the kitchen table. I can go off to a shared space, mostly a cafe. And it was only really in the writing of this book that I finally took to heart the message that I had read in literally every women's studies class I ever took, that a woman deserves a room of her own.
And how has that changed your writing life?
Well, I now have a little studio. Although I will tell you, I'm right now sitting at the kitchen table, so what does that mean? But I do have a little studio of my own that I love, and that's in the house, so it is part of the activity and action of the house, which is also something that's important to me. But it is separate. I can shut the door and be alone, and there's not room for anybody except the dog, whose bed is in a corner opposite the meditation pillow I never use.
So do you find that having your dog for companionship is helpful?
I think that having a dog is the perfect amount of companionship for a writer. I actually, for many years, I sort of squatted in my husband's office, and that was actually pretty good for quite a while. The companionship of writing side by side was really lovely. If we were to design a studio, which we actually did. We have a summer place in Maine, and we designed a studio that is the best of both worlds. It looks sort of like a butterfly wings, and at the body of the butterfly is a little bathroom, and each of us has a wing that's our own private space. But we can be companionable, but also have our separate space.
That sounds
We don't
perfect.
have that in Berkeley where we live, but now I do have my little office under the stairs.
Right.
And my office actually has this really amazing legacy. I mean, amazing for me. This house was built in 1907 by a doctor named Dr. Schaefer. It was part of a planned development of houses built during that period in the craftsman style. And Dr. Schaefer had a consulting room that is now my office, this little room with its own separate entrance going out the back. And we later found out that Dr. Schaefer provided abortion services. So secretly, you had to go in the back door. I love the idea my office was once the office of this abortion provider.
Well, somebody who knew the value of what he was doing and
yes,
helped
exactly.
women.
More than 100 years of trying to do the right thing by women in this in this little office under the stairs.
Well, you know what? I hope that we're going to discuss your newest book, A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. We're going to discuss that, and maybe there's an idea for another book coming about this.
You know, I've frequently thought about that. There might be something. I really do like writing historical fiction. I'm germinating an idea now that I can't really talk about, but that has kind of a historical basis. I love the research involved in writing historical fiction. My last book, Love and Treasure, was set in 1913 in Hungary and in 1946 in Salzburg. I love doing the research, and I love trying to imagine myself into the head and lives of people during those periods. Although this book, A Really Good Day, also sort of satisfied my research, Jones, because it's memoir, but it's also a lot of science and a lot of history and theory. It's about the war on drugs, so it's about politics, it's about the neurochemistry of drugs, and it's about the history of LSD and the history of the war on drugs, all of those things together.
Right, and so now you've divulged that what you were microdosing was with the illegal drug LSD.
Yes.
And you tell us that this microdosing is being done by an increasingly vocal group of scientists and civilians that are underground now. And it is being used to successfully treat severe mood disorders.
It is, among many other things.
And so as you've been talking about, you have drawn on your experience in this memoir and in thinking about your project and its effects on you of your background as a public defender and a mother of teenagers. And in so many ways, to me, the book and the writing of it seems a culmination of all your experience as a daughter growing up with a father suffering depression.
Yes, my father had bipolar disorder, bipolar disorder.
As a lawyer and a public defender, as a mother and a wife, and as a writer. And that's a big, huge landscape.
Right. You know, in a way, like the more that I think about the sort of the scope of this book, in a way it's kind of the book that LSD wrote. Because I wrote the first draft while I was doing this microdosing experiment. And the thing about LSD and other psychedelic drugs is that we know now, there are researchers at Imperial College London doing research, basically putting people who are tripping on LSD into fMRI machines. I can't imagine anything more horrible, but there you go. And what they found is that under the influence of psychedelic drugs like LSD, people's brains communicate in unusual ways. Parts of the brain that don't normally interact begin to interact. And the default mode network, which is sort of the kind of superego, the scold that says to you, do what you're told, behave, that is silenced. Maybe not necessarily silenced, but certainly quieted. And you can have all of these really interesting connections that make kind of creative cross-pollination of different parts of your brain. And that's why people have these psychedelic trips in which they see unusual colors and they experience unusual textures. And in microdosing, you don't hallucinate. You don't experience anything like that. But I don't think it's an accident that the book I wrote while microdosing is a book that's full of lots of different subjects that interact in unusual and, I would argue, interesting and compelling ways. If nothing else, it's a good metaphor for the experiment.
Absolutely. And I have to say, as a reader, I thought it was incredibly fluid. I was taking in all this information and never feeling lost and never feeling confused. I just kept
I'm so glad.
wanting to read. So I'm supposing that the people listening would really like to know what you mean by microdosing and why and how you got into this experiment and for how long?
A microdose is a small dose of a substance, a dose that's so small it's not perceptual, but large enough that you experience some kind of metabolic effect. In the case of LSD, the typical sort of LSD trip dose, the typical dose that someone who is at Burning Man is going to take, is somewhere between 100 and 150 micrograms. There are those who take more, but that's sort of the more typical dose. And when you microdose with LSD, you take 10 micrograms, a tenth of that, and you do it every 2 to 3 days. I did it on a 3-day cycle. And the reason I did this was because I have a mood disorder that's tied to my menstrual cycles. And it was very well controlled with a week of antidepressants, SSRIs, right before my period. But as I approached menopause, and I was in that perimenopausal period, the premenopausal period, I could no longer predict with any accuracy when I was going to menstruate. If I couldn't predict, I couldn't time my medication. And so my mood plummeted. I got more and more depressed. No medications were working. And I began to read all of this research about psychedelic drugs and depression and anxiety. And it turns out that psychedelic drugs are remarkably useful in alleviating depression and anxiety when given in large doses, we know for sure. There hasn't been as yet a microdose study. There's lots of research from the early part of when LSD was still legal, but there's recent research from NYU, from Johns Hopkins, from UCLA Harbor Medical School, and from the Imperial College London, and also there's a research in Switzerland that shows that when given in psychedelic doses, hallucinogens like psilocybin and LSD can profoundly improve mood and anxiety. There's even research that shows that individuals who have taken LSD are less likely to have suicidal ideation or suicidal acts than individuals who haven't taken LSD, which is a pretty mind-boggling study. I mean, it doesn't say anything about causation, but it's a correlation study.
Yes.
So I was reading all this. All these people were feeling better. I was feeling like crap. And then I saw this video of James Fadiman, the psychedelic researcher from the 1960s who has popularized microdosing, who was describing the experience that people had. And he said they don't hallucinate, they don't see anything or hear anything, but at the end of the day, they look back on their day and they say to themselves, wow, that was a really good day. And that blew my mind because it had been so long since I had had a really good day that the idea of one was just magical.
It would be for most of us, and the very end of your book describes a good day in a very magical way. Well, it must have not been easy to get this all in action given that the drug is illegal.
Yeah, it's really, really illegal, and it's a big pain in the neck. So I am not a lawbreaker, really. I mean, I always say that I've done more drugs than some people my age, less drugs than Presidents Bush or Obama. I'm the kind of person who gives the change back at the grocery store when I get too much. I'm a real law-abiding citizen. And the idea of consistently, daily breaking the law for a period of time was very, very stressful to me. But the time that I made the decision to do this experiment, I really was desperate. I was suicidal. I was counting pills. I just decided that I had no other choice. I was willing to do it. But of course, then becomes the problem of, well, okay, yeah, you say you're willing to break the law, but how are you going to find the drugs to do that? And it turns out, I thought, I live in Berkeley, California. I was going to walk out my door and orange sunshine was going to rain down on my head. But it turns out that I just don't know any LSD users, even people who I thought might be LSD users, like friends who went to Burning Man or friends who were Maker Faire participants. They either thought I was a narc and wouldn't give me anything, or they really genuinely didn't use any LSD at all. And eventually, I found the drugs that I used for my 30-day experiment through the most strange and really quite magical series of circumstances. I mentioned to an acquaintance that I was looking to microdose, and he told me that he had heard of a Bay Area-based professor who was very elderly and had microdosed for decades. And this elderly professor, he said, might be willing to share his doses with me because, after all, he wasn't going to live very long, and maybe he had extra. And I just thought that was the most ridiculous story, like the elderly candy man who gives you the... But it just seemed nuts to me. And I didn't pay any attention and continued searching for LSD. And then one day I went out to my mailbox, and there, amidst Victoria's Secret circulars and utility bills, was a little brown paper package. And in it was a tiny blue vial and a poem. And the return address on the package was Lewis Carroll. And although I wish that Professor Carroll, whoever he may be, had put a little tag on the bottle that said, "Drink me," he did not. But there was this little blue bottle, and if you would like, I'll read you the poem that he included.
Sure,
with the...
that would be great.
So the poem said, "Our lives may be no more than dewdrops on a summer morning, but surely it is better that we sparkle while we are here. Elsie."
If you just joined us on KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend, you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life with Sheila Bender. Today's guest is Israeli-American novelist and nonfiction author Ayelet Waldman.
Well, that was a very supportive message.
Yes, wasn't it?
Yes.
And there was enough of the drug to last me for the period of time of this experiment.
So he kind of knew a lot about these experiments, it sounds like, if he was able to
Yes,
do
he'd been
that
doing it for, I believe what I was told, which is that he was doing it for decades.
Uh-huh. So we don't know why, and you only had your 1 month, but had some very dramatic...
My paralyzing suicidal depression ended.
You have to ask the question, why? Why can't we have these kinds of things available to us? Because I think you also mentioned in the book that done properly, there really isn't side effects.
Well, there really aren't. I mean, that's what, so people have this, we think of LSD as this terrible drug that has so many side effects, but there's never been a verified death from overdose of LSD. There are 2 cases in the literature going back to the drug's inception. One is quite clearly an individual who died of exposure. Another is an individual who had a polydrug reaction. While there have been accidental deaths of people who have used LSD, who've, say, fallen or... There's never been a verified LSD overdose, which means that the drug itself is safe, and that what the experience depends on what's called your set and setting. So if you take LSD in a precarious, dangerous setting, it could be very dangerous. If you take LSD and you are yourself in a problematic state, then it can be dangerous for you too. So, for example, I wouldn't have taken, in the state that I was, the suicidal state that I was, I would not have taken a large dose of LSD, despite the fact that it's inversely correlated with suicidality. It wouldn't have been responsible to take that risk. But the microdoses have no such correlation. They're absolutely safe. There are no side effects. You know, anybody who's taken Zoloft or Prozac knows about all the myriad side effects, the sexual dysfunction, the weight gain, and LSD doesn't have any of those side effects. In the United States, the war on drugs, the criminalization of certain drugs, has very little to do with the drugs themselves and a lot to do with the context of the drugs, and particularly the race and class context of that the drugs were kind of used in or discovered in. So, for example, when the first drug law was created, the drug was addressed to Chinese opium dens. Why? Did we have some huge Chinese opium den problem? No. I mean, we definitely had an opioid problem. There were a lot at that time of opioid addicts, but the average opioid addict was a southern woman tippling from her bottle of laudanum, and the drug laws did nothing to interfere with that. They never would have. The law was really a means of attacking Chinese immigrants. And again we see that. You know, marijuana has been tied to Mexican immigrants. It was criminalized in order to attack them. African Americans have been victimized disproportionately in this country, I mean massively disproportionately, by the criminalization of different drugs, including the crack cocaine sentencing disparity. Cocaine, most often used and sold by white people, is punished much less severely than the identical drug, crack, which is used and sold primarily by African American people. And the disparity of that sentences has nothing to do with science, but everything to do with wanting to imprison as many black people as possible. And LSD was tied in the 60s to the anti-war movement, to the counterculture, and middle America, white middle America, became very, very anxious at the prospect of their children tuning in, turning on, and dropping out, as Timothy Leary exhorted them to do, and joining the anti-war movement, and joining forces with the civil rights movement. So LSD, despite all of the research, even back then, that showed its usefulness, was criminalized really as a way to attack those individuals.
This is so sad. And I can, just in your talking, I can see how much it reflects how you handle this in the book, how you really inform people at the same time that you're telling the story of your month of microdosing. It's very appreciated. One of those things that's just so hard to grasp, why we can't be progressive and why we can't do what's really good for people and humanity and instead have to concoct these other things. Makes me sad. Your book ends on a very happy note, which is that it worked.
It did work. Which sort of begs the question, why am I not doing it now, right? Especially since we're all going slowly crazy from
Yes.
stress and despair at the current situation.
Which is what I was going to say is, couldn't we have our Congress and president start microdosing? Would it change
right.
everything?
I don't think there's enough LSD in the world to make Donald Trump a decent human being. Certainly, it would help if we were all on drugs to deal with the next 4 to 8 years. So in all seriousness, this period has been incredibly stressful for everybody, but certainly people with mental illnesses. And I think that it's ironic that even as we are ignoring the potential therapeutic value of drugs like LSD, we are in a situation where we need them more than ever. Even Trump aside, there are ever-increasing numbers of individuals who are taking antidepressants, some with positive effect, many with no discernible positive effect. But we're not likely to see decriminalization anytime soon, despite the fact that most people agree that decriminalization of all drugs would not only be useful from the point of view of medical advancement, but would be tremendously helpful in decreasing the number, or sort of over-incarceration rate. It would enhance justice. We would take away the profit incentive. The drug cartels that have so profited so handsomely off the drug war would no longer have a source of profit. The individuals who have died as a result of these drug barons and their horrible wars throughout Latin America and other in Asia. Decriminalization would simply end this terrible scourge.
Well, let me ask you what you hope. I mean, besides that it has a good readership and that people enjoy your book and are educated, do you have a hope for the impact of this book beyond that?
When I wrote the book, I wanted to be part of a conversation that would lead to a sane drug policy. I wanted to be part of the drug policy reform conversation because I had been doing that for so long, working in the area of drug policy reform. Now, my hope is just that I'm another voice in the wind.
Well, you do start the book, and we've said it on the air right now, that there is an increasingly vocal group of participants and scientists, and certainly you've joined them.
It was definitely not my intention, but I know that the number of people microdosing has increased exponentially since the book was published, which I think is a pretty clear sign that it's increased interest. And I think that's a good thing, you know. I mean, I think if people are finding something that makes them feel better, that's a good thing. As long as they're responsible, as long as they're testing their drugs before they use it, as long as they're consenting adults.
I would really like to ask you about anything you'd like to tell us about what it's like to have written something so personal, even though it's full of research and background.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Like, I never anticipated, it makes me sound like an idiot to say this, but I never anticipated that at my events, I knew there would be people who were microdosed there, but it didn't occur to me that there would be so many people at my events who are in so much pain. There would be so many people who are struggling with mental health issues. And at every event I do, there are at least 2 or 3 or 4 people who come up to me desperate and in pain and looking for help. And I should have had a plan from the very beginning about how I was going to handle that, and I have developed one since. And the most important thing for me is to be present for those people. I feel like in a way, you know, my book has been, I don't know if it's triggered their emotions or if it's given them an opportunity to seek a fellow traveler, but for whatever they look to me for, I feel like it is my obligation to, at the very least, be a ready ear and hold that experience between us for a little while. And that's been incredibly satisfying in many ways. It's also been hard. It's been hard from the point of view of a person with a mood disorder to constantly handle the pain of other people. But I feel like that's what I signed on to do, and I am adamant that that's part of my job. I think that people who write memoir, particularly memoir about painful things, need to prepare themselves for that, prepare themselves for the possibility that they will be holding the pain of others. And that's one of the jobs of the memoirist. I think as hard as that is to do, I think it is to write memoir is a privilege, to have your words read is a privilege, and you have to take responsibility for your readers to a certain extent.
I really, really love what you said, because so many people worry about, if I'm writing a memoir about such and such a thing, do I have really a right to? Is it okay to reveal these things? And you're giving us all, as memoir writers, permission, as long as we take the responsibility and realize we'll attract people who need to be heard. So thank you so much for that. And in our last few minutes together, I'm wondering if there's anything in particular you'd like to talk about, the effect of this on your family maybe, or of your book.
It's not perfect. It's by no means perfect. But I think what the therapy has done is it's allowed me more space to to try to utilize the tools of my therapy. I'm in dialectical behavioral therapy, which you guys probably know about more in Seattle than other people because the founder is there. And it's a kind of therapy that I've discovered recently and has been incredibly helpful to me and to my family. It's mostly about how you handle relationships. And I think there's no doubt that I am better at this than I was before I tried my microdosing experiment. But it's a huge amount of work, a huge amount of work. I don't think people, to be a responsible mother and to not hurt the people you love when you have a mood disorder is a constant battle. You just got to suit up and go into the fight.
Yes. And I love that you said it gives me more space, because it brings me back to the opening where we talked about you having a little office under the staircase, which made me think of Harry Potter, which made me think of magic. And the way these events have come together in your life, your history, your family history, your profession, your studies, your research, and then finally getting Lewis Carroll's extra LSD.
Right.
It
was so funny because people used to say when I would ask them for LSD, if they didn't have it, they'd say, when you are ready for it, it will come to you. And I would just think that was so much nonsense. But there I was, ready, and it came for me.
Right. So hard work and magic kind of go together. Even
right, exactly.
Maybe don't think that way often, but your book certainly makes me think that way. Maybe we have a minute or two to talk about not necessarily exactly what you're writing now, but you said historical fiction, and so it's a big turn of events.
Ever since the election, I've realized that for me personally, I want to focus on bigger things. I read this line Roxane Gay said when she was doing a By the Book. She said she was sick of reading books about sad white people and sad white marriages. When I saw that line, I thought, oh my God, even the books of mine that are about the Holocaust are pretty much only about sad white people and sad white marriages during the Holocaust. I started thinking about what I wanted to write and how I wanted to write it, and I've decided that I want to make sure that the next novel that I write in these terrible, terrible times is a novel that has some meaning beyond the typical. And so I'm struggling to find a way to write something that has a political quality but that is not polemical. So that's my drama right now, trying to figure out how to do that.
I'm going to tell you before we end that I think you do take on very big jobs, and I look forward to reading that book when you've written it and it comes out.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Ayelet, for this conversation.
All right. It's a pleasure talking to you.
You can learn more about Ayelet Waldman, spelled Ayelet, then Waldman, at her website, www.ayeletwaldman.com.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.